June 28, 2024, the day the unipolar moment cracked. Let me tell you about the moment I realized the United States was no longer the undisputed hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't the fall of Kabul in 2021, nor was it Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. No, it was something far quieter, far more insidious, because it happened in broad daylight, with the world's media barely registering its significance. On that Friday, Venezuela's National Electoral Council announced that President Nicolas Maduro had won a third term in an election that, by all official accounts, was neither free nor fair. The U.S. State Department, the OAS, and the EU immediately condemned the result, demanding a full audit. The White House issued a statement calling the election a sham, and within hours, the Treasury Department extended sanctions, freezing Venezuelan assets and threatening secondary measures against any foreign entity doing business with Caracas. The message was "This will not stand." But here's what no one in the mainstream press bothered to. Why now? Why, after years of tolerating, even enabling, Maduro's authoritarianism, did the US suddenly draw a red line? And more importantly, why did Venezuela, a country on its knees, with an economy in ruins and a population fleeing by the millions, not back down? I've spent the last 3 decades studying the mechanics of American power, how it projects, how it retreats, and how it breaks. And what I saw in that moment wasn't just another diplomatic spat. It was the first real test of whether the United States still has the will and the means to enforce its vision of global order. And the early results? They're not encouraging. The official democracy under siege. Here's what they want you to believe. On July 28, Venezuela held a presidential election. The opposition, led by Edmundo Gonzalez and backed by Maria Corina Machado, claimed victory in a landslide. Exit polls, independent observers, and even some government-aligned institutions suggested Gonzalez had won by as much as 30 points. The Maduro regime, facing the prospect of losing power for the first time in a quarter century, did what authoritarian regimes had: rigged the vote. The National Electoral Council, packed with loyalists, declared Maduro the winner with 51% of the vote, while refusing to release the full tally. The streets erupted in protest. The US and its allies denounced the fraud. Sanctions were tightened. The world was supposed to rally behind democracy. That's the story. And on the surface, it's compelling. Venezuela is a dictatorship. Maduro has jailed opponents, crushed dissent, and presided over one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. The US should stand for democracy. And if you believe that this is purely about human rights and electoral integrity, then the response makes sense. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. It ignores the fact that the US has spent the last decade actively undermining Venezuelan democracy, not just under Maduro, but under his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. It ignores the 2002 coup attempt against Chavez, which the US quietly supported. It ignores the 2019 humanitarian aid stunt, where the Trump administration tried to force regime change by backing Juan Guaidó, a man who never held real power. And it ignores the fact that, for all its flaws, the Maduro government has survived despite US sanctions, not because of them. So if this isn't really about democracy, what's it about? Let me tell you what's really going on. Deconstructing the hidden reality. The first thing you need to understand is that Venezuela's election wasn't just an internal affair. It was a geopolitical stress test, and the US failed. For years, Washington has operated under the assumption that economic pressure alone can force regime change. The logic is squeeze the economy, starve the government of revenue, and wait for the people to rise up. It's the same playbook used against Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. And for a while, it seemed to work in Venezuela. Between 2017 and 2020, US sanctions cut off Caracas from global financial markets, collapsed oil production, and triggered hyperinflation. By 2021, Venezuela's GDP had shrunk by 75%, a depression worse than the US in the 1930s. But here's the part they don't tell: Maduro didn't fall. Instead, he adapted. How? By doing what any rational leader of a sanctioned state would do: he turned to America's adversaries. Russia and China became Venezuela's lifelines. Moscow sent military advisors, refinanced debt, and kept PDVSA afloat. Beijing provided loans, infrastructure investment, and, crucially, alternative payment systems to bypass U.S. sanctions. Iran, another U.S. target, sent fuel and technical expertise to restart Venezuela's refineries. And then there's the gold. Venezuela's central bank, cut off from the dollar system, began selling its gold reserves through intermediaries in Turkey, the UAE, and even Russia. By 2023, Maduro had stabilized the economy enough to avoid total collapse. Now, let's talk about the election itself. The opposition's claim of a 30-point victory? It's based on exit polls from a handful of urban centers. But Venezuela's electoral system is not like the US or Europe. Rural areas, where Maduro still has support, are harder to poll. The opposition's own internal data suggested a much closer race, somewhere in the 52 to 48 range. That's still a loss for Maduro, but not the landslide being reported. And here's the US knew this. Intelligence reports, leaked to the press, showed that US officials were aware the election would be close and that Maduro would never accept defeat. So why push for a confrontation now? Because this was never just about Venezuela. The broader geopolitical chessboard. Let me put this in context. The US is engaged in a three-front struggle for global against Russia in Europe, against China in Asia, and less visibly against both in Latin America. Venezuela is the linchpin of that third front. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is America's exclusive sphere of influence, was an unchallenged fact of international relations. But today, Russia and China are openly contesting it. Moscow has military bases in Nicaragua and Cuba. Beijing has turned AMA, Ecuador, and Argentina into key nodes in its Belt and Road Initiative. And Venezuela? It's the crown jewel. The country sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. It's a gateway to the Caribbean, a potential military outpost, and a testing ground for anti-American alliances. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In 2023, the Biden administration temporarily eased sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for Maduro allowing free elections. The deal was you let the opposition compete, we let you sell oil. For a moment, it looked like a rare diplomatic success. But then, in the months leading up to the vote, Maduro did what he always does, he cracked down. Opposition figures were arrested. Machado was barred from running. The US warned him to stop. He didn't. So why did the US react so strongly to this election? Because it wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about sending a message to the rest of the you can't play both sides. But here's the problem. The message didn't land. Instead of isolating Maduro, the US found itself isolated. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, three of Latin America's largest democracies, refused to condemn the election. The UN Security Council deadlocked. Even the EU, usually a reliable US partner, stopped short of calling the vote fraudulent. And Russia and China? They doubled down. Putin congratulated Maduro. Xi Jinping offered new loans. Iran sent more fuel. This wasn't just a diplomatic setback. It was a strategic one. Because what it revealed was that the US no longer has the leverage it once did. Military, the illusion of easy solutions. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get dangerous. The US has a long history of regime change operations in Latin America. Guatemala in 1954. Chile in 1973. AMA in 1989. Grenada in 1983. But those were different times. The Soviet Union was a rival, but it wasn't a peer. Today, Russia and China are peers, and they're not sitting on the sidelines. Venezuela is one of the most militarized countries in the hemisphere. It has Russian S-300 air defense systems, Chinese radars, and Iranian drones. Its military, though poorly trained, is large, over 120,000 active personnel, with another 200,000 in reserves. And crucially, it has allies. Russia has warned that any US intervention would trigger a response. China has economic leverage over half the region. And Iran? It's already shown it can strike U.S. assets in the Middle East with impunity. Now, I've heard the hawks in Washington we don't need boots on the ground. We can do this with sanctions, cyber attacks, and proxy forces. Let me be that's delusional. Sanctions? They've been tried. They failed. Cyber attacks? Venezuela's infrastructure is too primitive to be a major target. Proxy forces? The opposition is divided, and Maduro's security services are ruthless. The last time the U.S. tried to arm anti-Maduro rebels, in 2019, the operation was exposed before it even began. And let's not forget the domino effect. If the U.S. invades Venezuela, what's to stop Russia from sending troops to Cuba? What's to stop China from deepening its military ties with Nicaragua? The last time the U.S. faced a crisis like this in its own backyard was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that nearly ended in nuclear war. The truth is, the U.S. military is stretched thin. It's still supporting Ukraine. It's still deterring China in the South China Sea. It's still fighting remnants of ISIS in the Middle East. And now, it's supposed to open a third front in Venezuela? That's not strategy. That's fantasy. The domestic political game. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about politics, American politics. Let me tell you something that no one in the Biden administration will need this crisis. Think about it. The 2024 election is a referendum on Biden's leadership. His approval ratings are underwater. Inflation is still a problem. The border is a disaster. And the one area where he's supposed to have an advantage? Foreign policy. But Ukraine is a quagmire. Gaza is a PR nightmare. And China? No one wants a war over Taiwan. So what's left? Venezuela. By framing this as a battle between democracy and dictatorship, Biden gets to look tough. He gets to rally the Latin American vote in Florida, a key swing state. And he gets to distract from his domestic failures. It's the same playbook Trump used in 2019 with Guaido, except this time, the stakes are higher. But here's the it's not working. Because while Biden is playing politics, Maduro is playing chess. He knows the U.S. can't afford another failed intervention. He knows Russia and China will back him. And he knows that if he holds firm, the U.S. will eventually have to negotiate. And that's exactly what's happening. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the diplomatic off-ramp. The most likely outcome is that the U.S. and Venezuela enter a de facto stalemate. The U.S. tightens sanctions, but not enough to collapse the economy. Maduro cracks down on protests, but not enough to trigger a full-blown uprising. Russia and China keep Venezuela afloat. And after the U.S. election, both sides quietly negotiate a deal, limited sanctions relief in exchange for minor concessions, like releasing political prisoners. This is the least bad outcome. But it's also the most unstable, because it leaves the underlying tensions unresolved. Scenario 2, escalation into proxy war. This is the scenario I'm most worried about. The U.S. increases support for the opposition, possibly even arming rebel factions. Maduro responds by deepening ties with Russia and Iran. Protests turn violent. The military fractures. And suddenly, you have a de facto civil war with the US on one side, and Russia, China, and Iran on the other. This is how conflicts start. Not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping escalation that no one intended. Scenario 3, direct US intervention. This is the least likely but most dangerous scenario. If the US decides that Maduro's survival is an existential threat, it could launch a limited military strike targeting oil infrastructure, leadership compounds, or even a humanitarian no-fly zone. But here's the it won't work. Venezuela isn't AMA or Grenada. It's a country of 28 million people, with a military that's been preparing for this for years. And if the US invades, Russia and China will respond either directly or by escalating elsewhere. This isn't 2003. The world has changed. The grand strategy failure. Now, let me step back and ask the bigger why is the US in this mess in the first place? The answer is because it refuses to accept that the unipolar moment is over. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image. That it can overthrow regimes, rewrite constitutions, and impose its will without consequences. But that era is ending. The world is becoming multipolar. And the US is struggling to adapt. Venezuela is just the latest example. The US tried to isolate it. It failed. It tried to sanction it. It failed. It tried to overthrow its government. It failed. And now, it's left with it accept reality, or double down on failure. The problem is, the US foreign policy establishment hates accepting reality. It's addicted to the idea of American primacy. And that addiction is leading us into one disaster after another. What should be done instead? So what's the alternative? How does the US extricate itself from this mess without looking weak? Here's what I would do if I were advising the White. 1. Stop the regime change fantasies. The US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere. Not in the short term, and probably not in the long term. The goal should be containment, not overthrow. 2. Negotiate a grand bargain. The US should offer sanctions relief in exchange for real concessions, freeing political prisoners, allowing international observers, and gradually reintegrating into the global economy. Not because Maduro deserves it, but because it's the only way to stabilize the country. 3. Counter Russia and China indirectly. Instead of trying to push them out of Venezuela, the US should focus on outcompeting them. That means investing in Latin America's economies, strengthening democratic institutions, and offering alternatives to Chinese loans and Russian arms. 4. Prepare for the long game. Venezuela's crisis won't be resolved in a year, or even a decade. The US needs to think in generational terms, just like it did with the Soviet Union. This isn't about surrender. It's about strategy. And right now, the US doesn't have one. The bigger America's empire in decline. Let me leave you with this. The Venezuela crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of an era. The era of American hegemony. The era of the indispensable nation. The era when the US could dictate terms to the world and expect compliance. That era is over. And the sooner the US accepts that, the better. But here's the empires don't go quietly. They lash out. They make mistakes. They double down on failure. And that's what we're seeing now. The question is, will the American people wake up in time? Or will we keep sleepwalking into one disaster after another, until the unipolar moment is nothing but a distant memory? I've spent my career studying the rise and fall of great powers. And I can tell you the signs of decline are unmistakable. But decline isn't inevitable. The US still has the resources, the alliances, and the resilience to adapt. But it needs to change course. And that starts with understanding what's really happening in Venezuela, not as a morality play, but as a geopolitical reality. Because in the end, the biggest threat to American power isn't Maduro, or Putin, or Xi. It's America's refusal to accept that the world has changed. And that, my friends, is the real story here. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just a diplomatic headache, it's a military one. And not in the way Washington likes to frame it. The Pentagon's been sounding alarms about Russian Wagner mercenaries, Iranian drones, and Chinese intelligence operations in Caracas for years, but the real threat isn't some shadowy proxy war. It's the fact that Venezuela has become a testing ground for a new kind of resistance to American power, one that doesn't rely on brute force, but on asymmetric endurance. Let me explain why this matters. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing, the Trump administration assumed Maduro would collapse under the weight of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and a few well-placed threats. They were wrong. Not because Maduro is a strategic genius, but because the U.S. miscalculated how much pain Venezuela could absorb and how little it cared about Western approval. That same year, Russia sent two nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Caracas in a deliberate show of force. The message wasn't just to Washington, it was to the entire global: if you stand up to America, we'll stand with you. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela has become a laboratory for what happens when a small country refuses to play by the rules of the unipolar order. And the results are instructive. The U.S. has imposed over 900 sanctions on Venezuela since 2017, according to the Treasury Department. The economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation once hit 1,000,000%. And yet, Maduro is still in power. Not because he's popular, he's not, but because the alternative isn't democracy. It's chaos. And in a region where the U.S. has a long history of backing coups, chaos is a feature, not a bug. But the military implications go deeper than that. Venezuela's armed forces, the FANB, are a case study in how to survive under siege. They've diversified their supply chains, relying on Iran for gasoline, Russia for spare parts, and China for surveillance tech. They've integrated paramilitary groups like the Colectivos into their security apparatus, blurring the line between state and non-state actors, a tactic straight out of Hezbollah's playbook. And they've done something even more: they've made the cost of regime change prohibitively high. Remember 2020, when a ragtag group of mercenaries, backed by a Florida-based security firm, Silvercorp USA, tried to infiltrate Venezuela and capture Maduro? It was a farce, but it revealed something important. The U.S. can't even outsource regime change anymore. The FANB, despite its corruption and inefficiency, has adapted. They've learned from Libya, from Syria, from Iraq. They know that if the U.S. wants to topple them, it'll have to do it the hard with boots on the ground. And that's a price no American president is willing to pay. Now, the Pentagon will tell you this is all about great power competition. They'll point to Russia's Wagner Group operating in Venezuela, or China's deepening economic ties, as proof that the U.S. is losing influence. And they're not wrong. But they're missing the bigger picture. The real shift isn't just that Russia and China are filling the vacuum. It's that Venezuela has become a node in a new, decentralized resistance to American hegemony, one that doesn't need a superpower's permission to exist. Take the recent military exercises. In 2023, Venezuela and Iran held joint naval drills in the Caribbean. The U.S. sent warships to monitor, but what could they do? The drills were legal. The waters were international. And the message was: we don't need your approval to operate in your backyard. This isn't the Cold War, where the US and USSR carved up the world into spheres of influence. This is something messier, something more fluid. A world where small states can play great powers against each other, where alliances are transactional, and where the old rules of deterrence no longer apply. Here's where it gets really dangerous. The US still thinks in terms of containment, of drawing red lines and enforcing them with sanctions and military posturing. But Venezuela has already crossed those lines. It's selling oil to China in yuan. It's hosting Russian military advisors. It's allowing Iranian cargo planes to land with impunity. And the US? It's stuck in a loop of its own making, where every escalation is met with more defiance, and every defiance is met with more sanctions, until the only thing left is the threat of force. But force is a blunt instrument. The US learned that in Iraq. It learned it in Afghanistan. And it's learning it again in Venezuela. The problem isn't that Maduro is strong. It's that the US has no good options. Invade? That's a political non-starter. Keep squeezing with sanctions? That's just punishing the Venezuelan people. Try to negotiate? That's admitting defeat. So what's left? The answer, unfortunately, is more of the same. More sanctions. More bluster. More failed coups. More of the same policies that have gotten us here in the first place. And that's the real military implication of Venezuela's. It's exposing the limits of American power in the 21st century. Let me put it this way. In 1904, Theodore Roosevelt issued his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin America to prevent chronic wrongdoing. Over a century later, the U.S. is still trying to enforce that vision. But the world has changed. The tools that worked in the 20th century, gunboat diplomacy, covert coups, economic coercion, are either too costly or too ineffective in the 21st. Venezuela isn't just resisting American pressure. It's proving that resistance is possible. And that's a lesson that won't be lost on other countries. Bolivia, Nicaragua, even Mexico, which has quietly been pushing back against U.S. influence on migration and energy. The more the U.S. doubles down on its failed Venezuela policy, the more it signals to the rest of the world that American power isn't what it used to be. Now, I'm not saying the U.S. is powerless. Far from it. It still has the world's largest economy, the most powerful military, and a network of alliances that no other country can match. But power isn't just about capability. It's about credibility. And right now, the U.S. is losing both. The question is, what comes next? Does the U.S. accept that its unipolar moment is over and adapt? Or does it keep pretending it can still dictate terms to the world? The answer will determine not just the future of Venezuela, but the future of American power itself. And that, more than any Russian bomber or Iranian drone, is what should keep policymakers in Washington up at night. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just playing out on the international stage, it's tearing at the seams of American domestic politics in ways that could reshape the next decade of U.S. foreign policy. The Venezuela question has become a proxy war for something much the soul of the American right, the future of the Democratic Party's progressive wing, and the increasingly fragile consensus around what America's role in the world should even be. Let me explain why this matters. For the past 2 decades, U.S. policy toward Venezuela has been a rare point of bipartisan agreement in Washington. Democrats and Republicans alike have treated the country as a rogue state, a narco-state, a failed experiment in 21st century socialism. The sanctions regime, first imposed under Obama in 2015 and dramatically exited under Trump, was never seriously questioned. Even Biden, who campaigned on a more humane approach to Latin America, has kept the pressure on, partly out of inertia, partly out of fear of looking weak. But that consensus is cracking, and the fractures are revealing something dangerous for the American public is no longer buying the old narrative. Take the 2024 election. On the surface, Venezuela hasn't been a major campaign issue. But dig deeper, and you'll see it's become a litmus test for something far more: the future of the Republican Party. Trump, of course, has always been a hardliner on Venezuela. He recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president in 2019, imposed sweeping sanctions, and even flirted with military options. But his base isn't what it used to be. The MAGA movement, once united in its disdain for socialist Venezuela, is now deeply divided. A growing faction of populist conservatives, led by figures like Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance, have started asking uncomfortable questions. Why are we still sanctioning a country that poses no direct threat to the U.S.? Why are we propping up a failed opposition that can't even win an election? Why are we spending political capital on a country that, frankly, most Americans couldn't find on a map? This isn't just fringe thinking. In March 2024, a group of 16 House Republicans, including some of the most vocal Trump allies, sent a letter to Biden urging him to ease sanctions on Venezuela. Their argument? That the policy has failed, that it's hurting American energy interests, and that it's time to try something new. That's a seismic shift. For the first time in years, the GOP is having a real debate about whether the old interventionist playbook still works. And if Trump wins in November, that debate could become policy. But here's the uncomfortable: the left isn't much better. The Democratic Party's progressive wing has been quietly pushing back against the Venezuela consensus for years, but their voices have been drowned out by the party's hawkish establishment. Figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have called for sanctions relief, arguing that the policy is cruel and counterproductive. But they've been marginalized, partly because the party's foreign policy apparatus is still dominated by Obama-era interventionists who see Venezuela as a moral crusade. The result? A Democratic Party that's deeply divided, with progressives increasingly alienated from the leadership and moderates terrified of being labeled soft on authoritarianism. So what happens if the U.S. keeps doubling down? Let's game out the scenarios. First, the status quo. Biden keeps the sanctions in place, the opposition remains fractured, and Maduro consolidates power. In this scenario, the US looks weak, the Venezuelan people suffer, and the rest of Latin America quietly moves closer to China and Russia. It's the worst of all worlds, except for the hawks in Washington, who can at least say they didn't surrender to Maduro. Second, a partial thaw. The US eases some sanctions in exchange for minor concessions, maybe a slightly freer election, maybe the release of a few political prisoners. This is the most likely outcome if Biden wins re-election, but it's also the most unstable. Maduro would pocket the concessions and give nothing in return, while the opposition would splinter even further between those willing to negotiate and those who see any deal as betrayal. And the US would still look like it's rewarding a dictator. Third, a full-blown crisis. If Trump wins, all bets are off. He could double down on sanctions, recognize a new opposition leader, or even push for regime change. But here's the tools that worked in the past: covert action, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, are far less effective today. Venezuela has already weathered the worst of US sanctions. Its economy is in shambles, but the regime has adapted. The military remains loyal. The opposition is weaker than ever. And the rest of the world, including key US allies, is no longer willing to play along. Let me put this in historical perspective. In 1954, the US overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected government with a CIA-backed coup. In 1973, it helped orchestrate the overthrow of Chile's Salvador Allende. In 1989, it invaded AMA to remove Manuel Noriega. These were brutal, undemocratic interventions, but they worked, at least in the short term. Today, the US can't even get its preferred candidate elected in Venezuela, let alone overthrow a government. That's not just a failure of policy. It's a failure of imagination. The real danger here isn't just that the US will lose influence in Venezuela. It's that the rest of the world will start to see American power as a paper tiger. If the US can't bend a small, economically devastated country to its will, what does that say about its ability to shape outcomes in the Middle East, in East Asia, in Europe? The answer is that it says a lot, and none of it is good for Washington. So where does this leave us? The most likely outcome, unfortunately, is more of the same. More sanctions. More bluster. More failed attempts to force a regime change that was never going to happen. But the longer this goes on, the more it exposes a deeper the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. It's just one player in a multipolar world, and its influence is waning. That's a hard pill to swallow for a country that spent the last century writing the rules of the international order. But it's the reality we're living in. And the sooner Washington accepts it, the sooner it can start crafting a foreign policy that actually works. Until then, we're stuck in this cycle of failure, where every misstep in Venezuela just reinforces the lesson that American power isn't what it used to be. And that, more than any election or sanction, is what should keep policymakers up at night. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of a grand strategy that has defined American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and the occasional covert operation could reshape governments in its image. The formula was impose sanctions, fund opposition groups, and wait for the regime to collapse under the weight of its own incompetence. It worked in Serbia in 2000, in Ukraine in 2014, even in Iran in 1953. But Venezuela has exposed the limits of that playbook. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The US has spent the last 30 years trying to export its version of democracy, often through coercion rather than persuasion. The problem isn't just that this approach is morally dubious, it's that it's strategically unsustainable. The world has changed. In 1999, when Hugo Chavez first took office, the US accounted for nearly a third of global GDP. Today, that number is closer to 25%, and China's share has nearly tripled. The dollar's dominance is being challenged by alternative payment systems, and even US allies are hedging their bets. When the European Union created Instex in 2019, a mechanism to bypass US sanctions on Iran, it wasn't just a technical workaround. It was a signal that the old rules no longer apply. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still trying to fight the last war. The sanctions on Venezuela aren't just hurting Maduro's government, they're accelerating the decline of American financial leverage. Every time Washington cuts a country off from the SWIFT system, it pushes that country and others watching from the sidelines toward alternatives like China's CIPS or Russia's SPFS. In 2020, Venezuela's oil exports to China were conducted in yuan, not dollars. That might seem like a footnote, but it's the kind of footnote that becomes a headline in a decade. The more the US weaponizes the dollar, the more it incentivizes the rest of the world to find ways around it. So what are the alternatives? The first, and most obvious, is for Washington to accept that it can't control every outcome. That doesn't mean abandoning Venezuela to authoritarianism, it means engaging with the reality that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term. The Biden administration's half-hearted attempts at diplomacy, like the 2022 negotiations in Mexico, were a step in the right direction, but they were undermined by the same old maximalist free elections, amnesty for the opposition, and no guarantees for the regime. That's not diplomacy, that's surrender on installment. A smarter approach would be to treat Venezuela like a problem to be managed, not a battle to be won. That means lifting some sanctions in exchange for incremental concessions, allowing more humanitarian aid, releasing political prisoners, or even just toning down the anti-American rhetoric. It means working with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia, who have far more influence in Caracas than Washington does, to create a path toward stability. And it means recognizing that the opposition, for all its flaws, needs to be part of the solution, not just a tool for regime change. The second alternative is even the US needs to rethink its entire approach to Latin America. For too long, Washington has treated the region as its backyard, a place where it could intervene at will without consequences. But that era is over. The rise of left-wing governments in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil has created a bloc that is far more skeptical of US influence. Even right-wing leaders like Argentina's Javier Milei, who are ideologically aligned with Washington, are more interested in pragmatic deals than in towing the American line. The US can no longer assume that Latin America will follow its lead, it has to earn that trust. That brings me to the third, and most radical: the US could actually try to compete with China and Russia on their own terms. Right now, Beijing is outmaneuvering Washington in Venezuela by offering what the US won't: investment, trade, and no strings attached. China has lent Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, much of it in exchange for oil. Russia has provided military support and diplomatic cover at the UN. The US, by contrast, has offered sanctions and lectures about democracy. If Washington wants to counter Chinese influence, it needs to offer something more than moralizing. That could mean reviving the kind of infrastructure projects that the US used to fund in the region: roads, ports, energy grids, without the ideological baggage. But here's the: none of these alternatives are palatable to the US foreign policy establishment. The idea of negotiating with Maduro, or treating Venezuela as a peer rather than a pariah, is heresy in Washington. The same goes for accepting that Latin America might have its own agenda, independent of US interests. And competing with China on economic terms would require a level of investment and long-term thinking that the US political system isn't designed for. That's why we're stuck in this cycle of failure. Let me be: I'm not arguing that the US should abandon its values or its interests. But values and interests aren't the same thing as control. The US can still promote democracy, human rights, and free markets, but it has to do so in a way that acknowledges the limits of its power. That means accepting that some countries will choose their own path, even if that path is messy, corrupt, or authoritarian. It means recognizing that the era of unipolarity is over, and that the US is now one of several great powers, not the sole arbiter of global affairs. The real question is whether Washington can adapt. The signs aren't encouraging. The 2024 US presidential election is shaping up to be a contest between two visions of America: one that doubles down on coercion, and another that retreats into isolation. Neither offers a way forward. The first will only accelerate the erosion of US influence, the second will cede the field to China and Russia. What's missing is a third: a foreign policy that is confident enough to engage with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. That's the lesson of Venezuela. It's not just that the US can't impose its will on a small country anymore. It's that the world has changed, and the strategies that worked in the 20th century are obsolete in the 21st. The sooner Washington accepts that, the sooner it can start crafting a foreign policy that actually works. Until then, we'll keep seeing the same story play: sanctions, bluster, failure. And every time it happens, the rest of the world will draw the same: American power isn't what it used to be. And that, more than any election or sanction, is the real geopolitical shift of our time.